What if I told you that ancient kings ruled for 36,000 years, and we have the receipts? Not myth, not metaphor. Official government records pressed into clay by bureaucrats who also counted grain and taxed merchants. What if the first civilization appeared fully formed, with no rough drafts, with writing already perfected, with mathematics that wouldn't be matched for 3,000 years, with astronomy so precise they tracked Venus's orbit to within a single day of accuracy before anyone had telescopes to confirm it? What if every tablet they left behind whispered the same impossible confession? This is the restoration of what was before, not the invention, not the beginning, but the rebuilding of something magnificent that drowned. The Sumerians shouldn't exist the way they do. Civilizations are supposed to crawl slowly toward complexity, one invention leading to the next, one generation slightly smarter than the last. But in 3,500 years before the Common Era, in the river valleys of southern Iraq, a people appeared who already knew how to measure the heavens, who built cities for 50,000 people with geometric precision, who created a number system based on 60 that we still use every time we check a clock or draw a circle. And when archaeologists finally translated their words after 5,000 years of silence, they found something that makes the skin prickle. These people weren't claiming to be first, they were claiming to be the ones who remembered. You're standing in a storage room in the British Museum, 1872, and your hands are shaking slightly because you've just read something that shouldn't be possible. The tablet in your palm is cool and heavy, covered in wedge-shaped marks that took you months to decipher, and the words you're reading describe kings who ruled before a great flood, rulers whose reigns stretched not for decades, but for tens of thousands of years. And after them, the text says simply, "Then the flood swept over. And when the waters receded, Kingship descended again from heaven." And you stand there, in the dim light, surrounded by thousands of these clay voices, wondering if you've just discovered the oldest historical record ever written, or the most elaborate mythology ever conceived. Except the tone isn't mythic, it's clerical, it's bureaucratic. It's written in the same voice that recorded tax payments and temple offerings. And that precision, that matter-of-fact recording of the impossible, is what makes you pause. You can almost feel the hand that pressed these marks 5,000 years ago, a scribe who believed every word, who was perhaps copying from something even older. And you realize that whether these numbers are literal or symbolic or something we don't have words for yet, the Sumerians were trying desperately to preserve a memory of something that came before them, something they called the time before the flood. And maybe, just maybe, they succeeded in ways we're only now beginning to understand. So before we go deeper into clay archives that contain star charts, medical procedures, philosophical poetry, and creation stories that sound disturbingly like genetic engineering, I want you to do something small. If you're listening now, wherever you are in the world, leave a comment about your time zone or the place you're listening from. I want to imagine this silence stretching across continents, connecting us the way the Sumerians once connected heaven and earth through their ziggurats and their writing. If you enjoy stories that drift in the space between documented history and forgotten memory, hit that like button, gently, no rush, there's no hurry in the dark. And subscribe only if you're ready to question what you thought you knew about human origins, because this isn't a journey toward answers. It's a journey toward better questions, and the deeper we go, the more it feels like we're not discovering the past, but remembering something our species forgot how to say out loud. The story begins not with discovery, but with dust and determination. In the late 1800s, when European archaeologists first pushed spades into the plains near ancient Uruk and Ur, they were searching for biblical proof, for evidence of Babylon and Nineveh, for anything that might confirm the Old Testament stories their culture had been built upon. What they found instead was older, much older. Beneath layers of Islamic and Persian and Greek and Roman occupation, beneath the ruins of empires that had already been ancient when Christ walked the earth, they found tablets, thousands of them, tens of thousands, an entire civilization's memory baked into clay and buried by time. They called the people who made them Sumerians, a name taken from the land of Sumer, and as the decades passed and the wedge-shaped script slowly yielded its secrets, the archaeological world began to realize something unsettling. These weren't primitive people fumbling toward literacy. These were sophisticates who appeared in history already possessing law codes, medical knowledge, astronomical observations, architectural genius, and a writing system so complex it required decades of training to master. Their cities were planned with mathematical precision, their temples aligned with celestial bodies. Their number system, based on 60 rather than 10, was so advanced that it could express fractions and calculate geometric progressions with elegant ease. And perhaps most mysteriously, they seemed to believe that all of this knowledge, all of this sudden brilliance, had been given to them by beings they called the Anunnaki, those who from heaven to earth came, teachers who had walked among humans before the waters rose and washed the old world away. Chapter 1. The Sudden Birth. You're holding a piece of clay in your hands, and it's the oldest story ever written, and your fingers are trembling because you can feel the fingerprint of the person who made this, pressed into the surface 5,000 years ago when the world was younger, and the stars seemed closer, and gods still walked among the black-headed people in the land between two rivers. The tablet is cool, despite the warmth of the archive room, cool the way stone stays cool even in summer, and the surface is rough, like touching the scales of something ancient and sleeping. You trace the wedge-shaped marks with one finger, careful not to press too hard, because this clay survived the fall of empires and the burning of libraries and the slow, patient work of sand trying to erase everything. And now it sits in your palm, speaking across 5 millennia in a language that took scholars a century to decode. The marks aren't random scratches, they're geometry, perfect triangles pressed in perfect rows, each one a sound, each cluster a word, each line a thought that someone needed to preserve so badly they pressed it into mud and baked it hard as stone, and trusted that someday, somehow, someone would remember how to listen. That someone is you, standing in the British Museum on a morning in 1872, and what you're reading makes your breath catch in your throat, because you've just realized something that's going to haunt you for the rest of your life. This tablet describes a flood, a great deluge that covered the earth, a chosen man who built a vessel and saved the seed of all living things. And the story is beat for beat identical to Noah's flood, except this version is older, 1,000 years older than Genesis, older than Moses, older than anything in the Bible. And that single fact changes everything. You set the tablet down because your hands won't stop shaking, and you walk to the window and stare out at London's gray morning and try to reconcile what you've just read with the neat timeline of history you've been taught. The one that says civilization began with the Greeks and Romans, that everything before was primitive darkness, that the Bible represents the oldest wisdom. But here, in your hands, written in a script that predates alphabets, is proof that someone knew the flood story first, that someone was writing complex narratives with moral weight and theological sophistication while Egypt's pyramids were still new. The implications spiral outward like cracks in ice. If the Sumerians wrote this first, then what else did they know first? What else did they record that we've been crediting to later peoples? You turn back to the desk where thousands of tablets wait in careful rows, each one a voice from a world that shouldn't have been as sophisticated as it was, and you realize, with a vertigo that feels almost like falling, that you're standing at the edge of a mystery so deep that entire careers will be spent trying to explain it away. That scholars will argue for the next century about what these tablets mean and whether we should trust what they're telling us. The Sumerians appeared suddenly in history, and that word, suddenly, is the problem that archaeology can't quite solve. You don't see them learning to write over centuries. Don't find the rough drafts. Don't uncover the practice tablets where apprentices made mistakes. What you find instead is writing that's already complete, already grammatically complex, already capable of expressing abstract ideas, legal concepts, medical procedures, astronomical observations, poetry that makes you ache, even though it was written in a language nobody has spoken for 4,000 years. Their earliest cities aren't villages that grew slowly into towns. Their earliest cities are already cities. Plans with geometric precision, housing tens of thousands of people, built with brick that required organized labor and architectural knowledge and mathematical understanding. Uruk housed 50,000 people when most humans lived in extended family groups of 30 or 40, when seeing more than 100 people in one place would have been overwhelming. 50,000 people means water systems and food distribution and waste management and laws and all the invisible architecture of civilization that we take for granted. And the Sumerians had all of it figured out from the moment they appear in the archaeological record, as if someone handed them the instruction manual complete. You pick up another tablet, and this one describes the construction of a temple with measurements so precise that modern architects nod in approval when they see the ratios, the proportions, the way the structure is designed to bear weight and channel sound and align with the rising of certain stars. But this isn't from a mature civilization that had centuries to refine its techniques. This is early Sumer, when they should still be experimenting. And yet here they are, writing about load-bearing calculations and acoustic design and astronomical alignments as if these were already settled sciences. You set that tablet down and pick up another, and this one tracks the movement of Venus across the sky for an entire year, recording her appearances with a precision that modern astronomers verified using computer models, verified and confirmed, and couldn't explain, because you can't track Venus that accurately with naked eyes unless you've been watching for generations, unless someone taught you where to look and when, unless you inherited the knowledge from someone who already knew. The tablets keep speaking, and what they're saying underneath all the grain counts and tax records is something that makes the hair on your neck stand up. They're saying, we know this because we were taught. They're saying, we know this because someone who came before showed us how. There's a word that appears again and again in Sumerian texts, and the word is difficult to translate because it sits at the intersection of several concepts that don't map onto English. Sometimes it's translated as restoration, sometimes as renewal, sometimes as the recreation of what was. But the core meaning is consistent. They believed they were rebuilding something, not inventing, not discovering, rebuilding. When they wrote about their great temple at Eridu, they said it was built according to the ancient plan. When they wrote about their laws, they said they were codifying what had always been known. When they wrote about their knowledge of the stars, they attributed it to the gods who taught their ancestors before the flood. They saw themselves not as pioneers, but as inheritors, not as creators, but as custodians of wisdom that came from somewhere else, from some time else, from a world that existed before the waters rose. You can read it in their king lists that begin with rulers who governed for 30,000 years before the flood swept over. You can read it in their creation myths, where gods fashion humanity to join a project already underway. You can read it in their architecture, where every ziggurat is described as a recreation of the sacred mountain they'd been told about, but could no longer quite remember how to build properly. Sometimes in the quiet of the archive room, you let yourself think thoughts that would get you laughed out of academic conferences. You think about what it would mean if they were telling the literal truth, if there really was something before, something older, something that drowned when the waters rose at the end of the last ice age, when glaciers melted and sea levels rose 400 feet, and coastlines that had been inhabited for millennia vanished beneath the waves. You think about civilizations that might have lived on those drowned coasts, cities that might have existed where now there's only ocean. knowledge that might have been preserved by survivors who made it inland and taught their children until the memory became myth, and the myth became these tablets saying, "We remember, we remember." We're trying to write down what we remember before we forget completely. The archaeology supports it in ways that make you uncomfortable. Beneath the Sumerian cities there's silt, clean river silt deposited by massive flooding, and beneath that silt there's evidence of earlier habitation, though so little survived that we can barely see them anymore, just ghosts in the stratigraphy. What if Sumer isn't the beginning, but the recovery? What if these people weren't being metaphorical, but descriptive? What if they really were trying to restore what the flood had washed away? Maybe that's why they wrote so much, why they pressed everything into clay, why they created libraries with tens of thousands of tablets when most civilizations were still passing knowledge through oral tradition. Maybe they knew. Maybe they understood that what they were preserving was already fragmentary, already incomplete, already fading, and they wanted to make sure that as much as possible survived the next catastrophe. Maybe every tablet was an act of faith that said the flood didn't win. Memory survives. Someone someday will read this and understand. You are that someone, standing in a museum 5,000 years after these words were written, reading voices that have outlasted empires and languages and entire ways of seeing the world. The clay preserved what stone couldn't, what metal wouldn't, what paper and parchment failed to protect. Clay from the earth, baked hard, simple and eternal, carrying voices across time. There's something almost unbearably moving about that act of preservation, about the faith it took to believe that pressing thoughts into mud would matter, that future generations would care enough to decode it. The Sumerians felt like they were at the end of something. You can read it in their lamentations, in their prayers to gods who no longer answered, in the way they described their achievements with weary pride, as if they knew they were doing their best with knowledge they'd inherited but didn't fully understand anymore. They built ziggurats that tried to reach heaven, but heaven had withdrawn. They wrote down stories of gods who used to walk among them, but those gods had departed. They measured the stars with precision, but felt like they were only copying what their ancestors had known more deeply. Every tablet is a monument to partial remembering, to the courage it takes to preserve what you can when you know you've already lost most of it, to the hope that what survives might be enough for someone later to piece together what was lost. What if civilization doesn't begin? What if it returns? What if every flowering of human culture is really just a successful act of remembrance, a generation that recovered enough fragments to rebuild something that looks new but is really older than we can imagine? What if the Sumerians understood this, understood that they weren't first, but were the first to write it down after the waters receded, the first to make memory permanent enough to survive another cycle? Maybe that's why they were so specific about dates and numbers, why they recorded not just that kings ruled, but for how long, why they tracked not just that stars moved, but exactly where and when. They were leaving evidence, leaving proof, saying to whoever would read these tablets in the far future, "This is what we knew, this is what we inherited, this is what we're passing forward. Don't let it disappear completely." You stand there holding clay that's been carrying that message for 5,000 years, and you realize you have a choice. You can explain it away, or you can listen to what they're actually saying, to the possibility that human history might be older and stranger and more cyclical than we've been taught. That maybe we've been here before, reached high before, known things before, and forgotten, and the Sumerians are the memory of that forgetting. If you're still listening, if you're here in this space between waking and dreaming, where ancient voices speak through clay, leave a comment about what you think those voices are trying to tell us, about whether you believe memory can survive 5,000 years, or 50,000 years, or however long it takes for truth to surface again. The question isn't whether the Sumerians were right. The question is why they believed it so completely that they wrote it down as fact. Why they repeated it across thousands of tablets. Why they built their entire civilization on restoration, not innovation. Something made them believe they were recovering what was lost. You can dismiss it as mythology, or you can sit with it. Let it disturb you. Let it open up the possibility that the story we've been told about human origins might be missing chapters that drowned when the coasts vanished and the old world washed away, leaving only fragments, only memories, only clay tablets that whisper, "We remember. We remember. We are the ones who kept the memory alive." But if they were only preserving fragments, if they were only copying from older sources they didn't fully understand, then what else was lost? What knowledge died completely because nobody remembered it clearly enough? What technologies or sciences or ways of seeing vanished in the flood? The tablets you're holding are answers that only generate deeper questions, evidence that proves something extraordinary happened while simultaneously hiding what that something was. We're left with the shadow of a greater light, the echo of a louder voice, the memory of a memory. And maybe that's all we'll ever have. But the Sumerians didn't think so. They thought memory could survive if you pressed it deep enough into the earth, if you baked it hard enough, if you wrote it clearly enough. They thought someone would come along and read their words and understand they were trying to tell us something about where we came from and what we lost, and why we keep building towers that try to touch the sky, as if we're trying to remember how to get back to something we can no longer name, but can still feel the absence of. Are you ready to go deeper into that absence? Because we haven't even touched the strangest part yet, the part that makes archaeologists argue and scholars write carefully worded papers that circle around implications nobody wants to state directly. The Sumerians didn't just write about restoration. They left us a king list, an official document that records every ruler from the first king to their present day. And that list begins with 8 rulers who governed before the flood. 8 kings whose combined reigns total 241,000 years. And the numbers aren't poetry. They're written in the same bureaucratic tone used for tax records, which means the Sumerians believed those numbers meant something, recorded something about time itself that we no longer understand, about ages that operated under different rules, about a world before the flood, where kings ruled in cosmic time and gods walked the earth. And if you can sit with those impossible numbers without explaining them away, if you can let them disturb you the way they should, then maybe you're ready to understand what the Sumerians were really trying to tell us about the deep past, about the time before time, about the age that drowned and took most of its secrets with it, leaving only these voices in the clay saying, "Remember, remember, please don't forget again." Chapter 2. The Impossible Kings. You're in a storage room in Baghdad, 1906, and the heat presses against the windows like something alive, like the desert itself is breathing against the glass, trying to get in. And your shirt sticks to your back as you lean over a wooden crate filled with tablets that smell of earth and time and secrets that have been buried so long they've become part of the ground itself. Your hands are dusty as you lift one tablet out, heavier than you expected, dense with the weight of baked clay and something else, something that feels like it shouldn't be measured in pounds or kilograms, but in years, in centuries, in the accumulated pressure of 5,000 years pressing down on this single piece of evidence. The wedge marks are crisp, despite the age. Whoever pressed them into wet clay had a steady hand, had confidence, had the bureaucratic precision of someone recording facts, not fantasies. And as you begin to read, as the symbols resolve themselves into words, and the words into sentences, and the sentences into a list that makes your pulse quicken, you realize you're holding something that's going to haunt scholarship for the next century. It's a king list, a genealogical record of every ruler who ever sat on Sumer's throne. Except this list doesn't begin with mortal men. It begins with something else entirely. With rulers whose reign lengths are written in numbers so large they break your understanding of what numbers in a historical document should look like. The first name on the list is Alulim, and next to his name, in the same matter-of-fact script used for grain taxes and temple offerings, it says he ruled for 28,800 years. You read the number twice, 3 times, thinking you've mistranslated, thinking the symbols must mean something else, but they don't. They mean exactly what they appear to mean. 28,800 years for a single reign. And as you move down the list, the numbers don't get smaller, they get larger. Al-Algar ruled for 36,000 years, and Menluana ruled for 43,200 years. 8 kings in total, before something happened. Before a line in the tablet that reads simply and devastatingly, "Then the flood swept over." And after that line, everything changes. After that line, the reigns become human-sized again. A few hundred years, a few decades, numbers you can hold in your mind without feeling like you're standing at the edge of an abyss. The total combined reigns of those 8 pre-flood kings comes to 241,200 years, and you sit back in your chair and stare at the ceiling where a fan turns slowly, uselessly against the heat, and you try to understand what you're reading. Try to fit it into any framework that makes sense, because this isn't mythology written in poetic language. This is bureaucracy. This is record-keeping. This is the same tone the Sumerians used when they wrote down how many sheep belonged to which temple and how much barley was owed in taxes. The tablet is cool in your hands despite the Baghdad heat. Cool the way things that have been underground stay cool even in summer. And you trace the cuneiform with one finger, following the groove where the stylus pressed 5,000 years ago. The scribe who wrote this believed what he was writing. You can feel it in the precision of the marks, in the way each symbol is placed with care, in the complete absence of hesitation or doubt. This wasn't someone recording legends they half believed. This was someone copying official records, transferring data from older tablets that were perhaps already ancient when this scribe lived. And that thought opens another vertigo. Because if this tablet from 4,000 years ago is copying from something older, then how old is the original source? How far back does the chain of memory go before it finally reaches the event itself? The thing that actually happened, that became the record, that became the copy, that became the tablet in your hands. The numbers are impossible, but they're also too specific to be random, too consistent across multiple copies found in different cities to be mistakes. Alulim's reign of 28,800 years appears the same way on tablets from Nippur and Larsa and Isin, which means this wasn't one scribe's error, but an official number, a figure that all of Sumer agreed upon, that they repeated and preserved and treated as historical fact. Some of the numbers are multiples of 3,600, and that's not an accident, because 3,600 was sacred to the Sumerians. They called it a sar, and it was their unit for measuring cosmic time, the time it takes for certain celestial events to repeat. And modern astronomers looking at these numbers have noticed something unsettling. If you divide some of these reign lengths by 3,600, you get numbers that correspond to precessional cycles, to the slow wobble of Earth's axis that causes the equinoxes to drift backward through the zodiac at a rate of 1 degree every 72 years. To measure precession, you need to observe the sky not for decades but for centuries, for millennia. You need continuous, unbroken record-keeping across generations that all understand what they're measuring and why it matters. And the Sumerians shouldn't have known about precession at all. It's a subtle phenomenon invisible to casual observation, yet here they are, encoding it into their king list as if reign length and celestial time were the same thing, as if their kings weren't just temporal rulers, but markers of cosmic epochs, placeholders for ages that we measure differently now, but which to them meant something specific, something real. You set the tablet down and walk to the window and look out at Baghdad's dusty streets where people move through the heat like shadows. And you think about time, about how we measure it, about how our lifetimes feel long to us, but are barely a flicker against geological time. And you wonder if the Sumerians were trying to record something we don't have language for anymore. Some way of experiencing duration that isn't personal human time, but something larger. Something that includes the movement of stars and the rising of waters, and the slow cycles of creation and destruction that govern everything. The flood that appears in the king list isn't described as punishment or cleansing. It's just an event, a marker that divides time into before and after. And on the other side of that marker, everything becomes smaller, more human, more like the history we recognize. Before the flood, cosmic time. After the flood, human time. Before the flood, kings who were perhaps gods or something between gods and men. After the flood, mortal rulers trying to rebuild what was lost. Every ancient culture has this same pattern, and that's what makes you uncomfortable. That's what keeps you awake at night in your rented room with the shutters closed against the heat. The Egyptians have the Turin Papyrus that lists divine rulers and demigods governing for thousands of years before the first human pharaohs. The Hindus have their yugas, vast ages lasting tens of thousands of years that end in fire and flood and begin again. The Mayans have their world ages, 4 previous worlds, each destroyed by catastrophe before this 5th world, this current world which they also believed would eventually end. The Greeks remembered Deucalion's flood. The Aztecs remembered Coxcox, who survived the waters in a hollow log. The patterns repeat across continents, across cultures that supposedly never contacted each other, and always the same structure: divine or semi-divine beings ruling in deep time, catastrophic flood, new beginning with shorter-lived humans who have to relearn everything. You can dismiss one culture's myth as imagination, but when the same story appears everywhere, told by people who lived on different continents and spoke different languages and worshipped different gods, then maybe it's not myth anymore. Maybe it's memory, fragmented and distorted by time, but still fundamentally describing the same event, the same before and after, the same sense that humanity once existed under different conditions, and then the waters rose and everything changed. The academic world doesn't know what to do with the king list. You've read the papers, the carefully worded arguments that try to explain the numbers as symbolic, as lunar cycles misinterpreted as solar years, as propaganda meant to give ancient kings divine authority by connecting them to impossibly long-lived predecessors. All the explanations are reasonable until you sit with the tablet itself, until you feel its weight, until you read it in the original language and realize that the Sumerians drew no distinction between this list and their other historical records. They treated it the same way, filed it in the same archives, copied it with the same bureaucratic precision they used for recording which city owed tribute to which temple. Either they believed these numbers meant what they said, or they were lying systematically across centuries, across cities, across the entire civilization. And systematic lying for no apparent benefit doesn't make sense. Propaganda makes sense when it serves a purpose. But what purpose does it serve to claim your earliest kings ruled before a flood that destroyed everything, that makes your civilization not more glorious, but more fragile, more temporary, more haunted by loss? You pick up the tablet again and read the line that comes after the flood, the line that says, "After the flood swept over, kingship was again lowered from heaven." And that word again is devastating, because it implies this happened before, implies that kingship, that civilization itself, that the entire structure of organized human society is something that descends and withdraws and descends again in cycles that we exist inside of without understanding them. The Sumerians saw themselves as living in the aftermath, in the recovery period, trying to rebuild what the flood had interrupted. And maybe that's why they wrote everything down so obsessively, why they pressed every scrap of knowledge into clay, because they knew it could all be washed away again, knew that what comes from heaven can return to heaven, knew that memory is the only thing that survives the waters if you press it deep enough into the earth. The king list isn't just history, it's insurance. It's a way of saying, if it happens again, if the waters rise again, if kingship withdraws again, then whoever finds this will know that it's happened before, and that we survived it once and built something beautiful in the aftermath, even though we could no longer touch the sky the way our ancestors did before the flood. In 1929, decades after you first read this tablet, an archaeologist named Leonard Woolley will dig beneath the city of Ur and find a layer of clean river silt 8 feet thick, with no artifacts, no pottery, no evidence of human habitation, just pure sediment deposited by water. And above it and below it, the traces of different civilizations. And he'll realize he's found evidence of the flood, the actual historical event that the myths describe. And he'll date it to around 2,900 years before the Common Era, which doesn't match the king list exactly, but which proves that massive flooding did happen, did interrupt settlement, did create a before and after in the physical stratigraphy of Mesopotamia. Similar flood layers will be found at other sites, at Kish, at Shuruppak, at Uruk. Not all from the same event, but all evidence that the people who wrote about the waters that swept over everything weren't inventing metaphors. They were describing catastrophes that happened, that buried cities, that forced survivors to start over. And maybe the king list's impossible numbers aren't trying to measure human lifespans, but something else, are trying to record the age of the world before it drowned, are trying to preserve the memory that once things were different, once time moved differently, once the distance between heaven and earth wasn't so vast. If you're still with me, if you're still here in this space where ancient records speak in numbers that break our understanding of time, leave a comment about what you think those numbers mean. Whether you think the Sumerians were recording actual duration or encoding something else into their king list. Whether you believe there's truth hidden in impossible numbers, or whether some mysteries are meant to stay mysterious. The question we're sitting with isn't whether these kings actually lived for tens of thousands of years. The question is what the Sumerians were trying to preserve by writing those numbers down as fact. What memory they were protecting. What truth about the deep past they believed was worth recording, even if future generations wouldn't understand it, even if it made them seem crazy, even if it meant their entire civilization would be dismissed as mythmakers instead of historians. The scholar Zecharia Sitchin spent his life wrestling with these numbers, and whether you agree with his interpretations or not, whether you think he was a visionary or a fantasist, he asked questions that deserve asking. He sat with the discomfort of the king list and refused to explain it away. And for that, he was dismissed by mainstream archaeology, called a pseudoscientist, called irresponsible. But maybe the real irresponsibility is refusing to sit with evidence that challenges our assumptions, refusing to acknowledge that the Sumerians might have been trying to tell us something important, that we've decided in advance can't be true because it doesn't fit our model of how civilization develops. Sitchin thought the Anunnaki were physical beings from another planet, thought the long rains recorded cosmic cycles related to that planet's orbit, thought the Sumerians were describing literal history, just in a language we've forgotten how to decode. And mainstream science looked at clay tablets that say, gods came from the sky, and decided this must be metaphor, must be mythology, must be anything except what it plainly states, because we've already decided that life from other worlds is too strange to be recorded in ancient history. Even though the mathematics of probability says the universe is vast and old, and life should be common. But that's a different argument, a different vertigo. What matters here is that the king list refuses easy interpretation, refuses to fit neatly into any framework, sits there with its impossible numbers, demanding that we either dismiss it entirely or accept that the Sumerians knew something about time, about history, about the structure of ages that we've lost. Maybe the kings didn't live for 36,000 years, but represented dynasties, bloodlines that ruled for epochs. And the numbers measure not individual lifespans, but the duration of ages named after their ruling families. Maybe the numbers are encoded astronomy, each digit representing celestial alignments that repeated in cycles the Sumerians tracked, but which we've forgotten how to read. Maybe the flood that divides the list marks not a single catastrophe, but the end of the last ice age, when sea levels rose 400 feet over centuries, and coastlines that had been inhabited for thousands of years vanished beneath the waves, taking entire populations with them, taking cities we'll never find because they're under 300 feet of ocean now. And maybe the survivors who made it inland carried memories of the before time, of the coastal civilizations that had grown sophisticated and complex during the Ice Age when the world was different, when the climate was stable for 20,000 years, giving humans time to develop in ways we can't see evidence for because the evidence drowned. The King List might be humanity's oldest memory of deep time, of the world before the waters rose, preserved in the only way it could be preserved, as numbers that don't make sense to us anymore, but which to the Sumerians represented something real, something that happened, something they believed future generations needed to know, even if those future generations, even if we, decided not to believe them. What haunts you as you sit in that Baghdad storage room with the tablet in your hands isn't the numbers themselves, but the grief underneath them, the sense that the Sumerians were mourning something, that every time they copied this list, every time they pressed those enormous numbers into fresh clay, they were commemorating a loss so vast that only cosmic numbers could contain it. The list is an elegy disguised as bureaucracy, a way of saying, we remember that we used to be more, that something magnificent existed before the waters, that we are the diminished children of a greater age. And if we don't write this down, if we don't preserve these numbers even when they seem impossible, then the forgetting will be complete, and it will be as if that earlier world never existed at all. Every ancient culture carries this grief, this sense of living in the ruins of something older. And maybe they're not wrong. Maybe we are living in aftermath. Maybe the story of human civilization isn't a steady climb from ignorance to enlightenment, but a series of rises and falls, peaks and valleys, ages that flourish and drown and flourish again. And maybe the Sumerians understood this because they'd lived through it. Because they were the generation that came after the flood and tried to rebuild, and knew that everything they were rebuilding had existed before, in forms more complete than what they could now achieve. Are you ready to see how deep this pattern goes? Because the King List is only the beginning. The Sumerians left us another mystery that's even stranger. They left us star charts and astronomical observations that show they knew things about the heavens they shouldn't have been able to know. That they tracked planets invisible to the naked eye. That they understood the geometry of the solar system in ways that shouldn't have been possible without instruments they didn't have. And when you read their astronomical tablets alongside their King List, when you see how often they connected cosmic time with earthly time, how often they wrote about the gods of heaven being the same as the planets that move through the sky, you begin to wonder if their entire civilization was an attempt to rebuild a science they'd inherited but no longer fully understood. If they were working from manuals they could read but couldn't quite comprehend, copying formulas that worked even when they didn't know why. And that thought should terrify you and thrill you in equal measure, because it means we might not be the first technological civilization to arise on this planet, just the first since the waters rose and the old world drowned. And if that's true, then everything we think we know about human history is just the most recent chapter in a much longer and stranger story. And maybe the Sumerians were trying to tell us this, trying to leave us clues, trying to say through their impossible numbers and their flood myths and their restoration language, look deeper, remember further. The past is older than you've been taught, and we are all living in the afterglow of something that burned brighter before it drowned. Chapter 3. Stargazers of the Deep Past. You're standing at the top of the Ziggurat of Ur at dawn, and the air is so still it feels like the world is holding its breath, waiting for something. And your own breath comes shallow because you're dizzy from the climb, and from the realization that's slowly crystallizing in your mind as you watch the horizon lighten from black to deep blue to that particular shade of gold that comes just before the sun breaks free. The stones beneath your feet are cool, but they'll be scorching by noon. Ancient brick baked 4,000 years ago and laid in patterns that your architect's eye recognizes as deliberate, as mathematical, as aligned with something greater than mere structural necessity. You kneel and place your palm flat against the surface and feel the grain of the brick, the slight depression where rainwater has worn channels over millennia. And you trace those channels with your fingers and realize they form lines, subtle lines that point, that direct, that if you follow them with your eye, lead to specific points on the horizon where stars rise, where planets appear, where the sun marks equinoxes and solstices with the precision of a cosmic clock. This building isn't just a temple, it's an instrument. Every angle calculated, every brick placed according to a plan that encoded astronomical knowledge into solid matter. And the Sumerians who built this weren't just worshipping the sky, they were measuring it, mapping it, recording its movements with an accuracy that makes you uncomfortable, because you know what accuracy like this requires. You know how many generations of continuous observation it takes to understand the slow dance of celestial bodies well enough to build their patterns into architecture that will outlast empires. The sun breaks the horizon, and light floods across the desert, and for a moment, just a moment, you can see it the way they saw it. Not as random photons traveling through space, but as a voice speaking in fire, as meaning encoded in light, as a message from the deep structure of reality itself. The Sumerians called the sun Utu, the moon Nana, the planets by names we translate as gods, but which they understood as something both physical and divine, as beings that were simultaneously material and sacred. And maybe they weren't wrong. Maybe we're the ones who made the mistake by separating matter from meaning, by deciding that things can be either real or holy, but not both. You stand there as the sun climbs higher, and you think about the tablets you've been studying, the astronomical records that cover the walls of your hotel room in neat stacks. Each one a voice from the deep past trying to tell you something that archaeology still hasn't fully heard. They tracked Venus with obsessive precision, recorded her disappearances and reappearances, noted the number of days she was visible as morning star and evening star, calculated her full cycle with an accuracy that modern astronomers have verified down to fractions of a day. And when you ask yourself how they did this, how Bronze Age people with no telescopes, no clocks more precise than sundials, no institutional memory more reliable than clay tablets, managed to nail the Venus cycle to within hours of what our satellites measure now, the only answer that makes sense is the one that sounds impossible. That they were copying from records that went back centuries, that stretched back generations, that represented not one person's lifetime of observation, but many lifetimes compiled into a single data set. And that means institutional continuity. That means a priesthood or a scholarly class that maintained protocols across centuries. That means a civilization that understood the value of long-term empirical observation, long before the scientific revolution supposedly taught humanity how to look at the world. The Venus tablets from the reign of Ammisaduqa record that Venus as evening star was visible for 3 months and 16 days, disappeared for 7 days, then reappeared as morning star for 3 months and 16 days, disappeared for 3 days, and the cycle began again. And the total period from first appearance to the same appearance in the next cycle was 584.92 days, which is so precise, so exact, that when modern astronomers first saw these numbers, they assumed there was a mistake in translation, or that the clay had been misdated, because this level of accuracy shouldn't exist in 2nd millennium BCE Mesopotamia. Except there was no mistake. The tablets say what they say. The numbers are what they are, and the only conclusion is that the Sumerians and their Babylonian successors knew the Venus cycle as well as we know it now, knew it through observation and record-keeping, and the patient accumulation of data across time periods longer than most civilizations last. You pick up a piece of broken brick from the ziggurat's edge and turn it in your hands, and wonder how many times someone stood where you're standing now, watching Venus rise, marking the date, adding their observation to the long chain of observations that would eventually become the tablets you've been reading. And that thought makes you feel connected to them across 4,000 years, connected through the shared act of watching the sky and trying to understand its patterns. But Venus is only the beginning, the surface of a deeper mystery that opens like an abyss the more you study the Sumerian astronomical corpus. They knew about precession, that slow wobble of Earth's axis that causes the position of the stars to drift backward through the zodiac at a rate of 1 degree every 72 years, completing a full cycle in roughly 26,000 years. And precession is subtle. It's not something you notice in a human lifetime, or even in 10 human lifetimes. It's something you only detect if you're comparing observations made centuries apart, if you're maintaining records across generations, if you understand that the universe moves in layers of time that dwarf individual existence. The Sumerians divided the sky into 12 sections that we still call the zodiac, and they understood that the sun at spring equinox slowly moves backward through these sections, spending about 2,160 years in each constellation before sliding into the previous one. And that knowledge, that understanding of deep celestial time, appears in their earliest records, appears in texts that should represent the childhood of astronomy, but which instead demonstrate its maturity, as if the Sumerians didn't learn to watch the stars, but inherited the practice from someone who had already mastered it. Their priests observed from the tops of ziggurats like the one you're standing on, and they wrote down everything they saw, every rising and setting, every conjunction and eclipse, every anomaly and regularity. And those observations were compiled into texts like the Mulapin, the Tablet of the Stars and the Plough, which lists constellations and their rising times, which describes the paths of the planets through the zodiac, which contains information about lunar eclipses and their prediction intervals. And modern scholars looking at the Mulapin have dated some of its observations to around 3,300 years before the Common Era, based on the precessional positions it describes, which means the knowledge encoded there is older than the tablet itself, maybe much older, maybe stretching back to the very beginning of Sumerian civilization, or even before, back to the mysterious time before the flood, when kings ruled in cosmic time, and knowledge flowed from heaven to earth in ways we can only glimpse through the fragments that survived. The precision haunts you. The care with which they recorded angles and times and intervals. The way they understood that celestial movements were regular enough to predict, mathematical enough to encode, meaningful enough to preserve across generations, even when the original reasons for preservation might have been forgotten. And you wonder if that's what happened. If the Sumerians inherited astronomical data from the pre-flood civilization and dutifully copied it forward without fully understanding why it mattered. If they were like monks in the Dark Ages preserving Latin texts they could read but not quite comprehend, maintaining a tradition because tradition itself had become sacred, even when its purpose had grown obscure. One tablet from Sipar describes something that still gives you chills when you read it. Describes the god Enki teaching humans to build instruments to see what cannot be seen. And the phrasing is specific, not metaphorical. It talks about chambers of glass that magnify the eyes, about devices that bring distant things near. And mainstream archaeology dismisses this as poetic language, as myth, as the obvious impossibility of Bronze Age peoples having optical technology. But you've seen the rock crystal lenses that have been found in Mesopotamian sites, small polished spheres of quartz that could focus light, that could magnify, that sit in museum cases labeled as decorative items, because we've decided in advance that they can't be tools, can't be instruments, can't be evidence of optical experimentation, because that doesn't fit the timeline we've constructed for technological development. The tablets describe the crystal that brings light to darkness, the vessel of shining copper that stores heaven's fire, the chamber where the gods wrote their names in light. And yes, these could be metaphors. Everything could be metaphors if we want them to be. But what if some of it is memory? Distorted memory, confused memory, but memory, nonetheless, of a time when humanity knew how to work with light and glass and crystal in ways we had to rediscover thousands of years later. If you're still here, if you're still breathing in this thin air at the top of the Ziggurat, watching the sun climb higher into the immense blue vault of the Mesopotamian sky, take a moment to imagine what the Sumerian priests saw when they stood where you're standing. Whether they saw the same stars you see, or whether the sky looked different to them. Not physically different, but meaning different. Whether they read messages in the movements of planets that we've forgotten how to decode. Whether the mathematics of celestial motion spoke to them in a language we've lost. Leave a comment about what you think when you look at the night sky. Whether you see dead matter moving through empty space, or whether some part of you still responds to the ancient idea that the heavens are alive, that they're watching back, that the universe is not a machine, but a mind, and we are thoughts inside it, trying to understand the thinking that contains us. The Sumerians built their entire civilization around this dialogue with the sky. They oriented their temples toward celestial points. They timed their festivals to planetary movements. They understood their kings as reflections of cosmic order. And maybe they were crazy. Maybe they were projecting meaning onto randomness. Or maybe they understood something we've forgotten in our rush to make the universe mechanical and dead and safe. The astronomical knowledge encoded in Sumerian tablets shouldn't exist the way it does. Shouldn't be as complete and precise and systematic as it is. And that wrongness, that sense that something doesn't fit the narrative of progressive human development, is what keeps you on this ziggurat past dawn, past the point where the sun becomes too bright to look at directly, past the point where the heat becomes oppressive and your water runs low. You're trying to feel what they felt, trying to understand how they understood, trying to bridge the gap between their world, where sky and earth were still in conversation, and our world, where we've exiled ourselves from the cosmos, where we've decided that meaning is something humans invent, rather than something we discover in the fabric of reality itself. The Sumerians didn't separate science from spirituality, didn't divide the measurable from the meaningful, didn't create the false choice between empiricism and enchantment that we've been living inside of since the Enlightenment. And maybe that integration, that wholeness, is what allowed them to see what we can no longer see, to know what we've forgotten, to build their civilization on the foundation of cosmic correspondence, where every earthly action echoed a heavenly pattern, and every heavenly pattern found its reflection in earthly form. The ziggurat beneath your feet is a scale model of the universe, each level corresponding to a celestial sphere, each color assigned to a planetary god. Black for Saturn, red for Mars, gold for the sun, silver for the moon. And as you climb down, as you descend through these levels, you're moving through the cosmos in miniature. You're performing in your body the same journey the soul was believed to make after death, rising through the spheres back to the source from which it came. This isn't primitive superstition. This is sophisticated cosmology. This is a model of reality that integrated astronomy and theology and architecture into a single coherent vision of how things are connected, how the microcosm reflects the macrocosm, how as above, so below. And whether that vision was literally true or not might be less important than the fact that believing it was true allowed the Sumerians to build observations and measurements and calculations into their physical structures, into their calendars, into their daily lives, in ways that kept them constantly aware of the larger patterns they were embedded in. We've gained a lot by learning to see the universe as dead matter governed by impersonal laws. But we've also lost something. Lost the sense of participation. Lost the feeling that our lives and our observations and our attempts to understand are part of what the universe is doing, are one of the ways the cosmos knows itself. Are you ready to see where this knowledge came from? Because the mystery deepens the further back you trace it. The Sumerians claimed they were taught by the Anunnaki, those who from heaven to earth came, beings they described not as distant invisible gods, but as teachers who walked among them, who showed them how to measure and write and build, who gave them the ME, those mysterious divine formulas that governed everything from kingship to music to the structure of temples. And whether you interpret the Anunnaki as aliens or as survivors of a pre-flood civilization, or as mythological personifications of natural forces, the fact remains that the Sumerians consistently credited their knowledge to external sources, to teachers who preceded them, to a transmission of wisdom rather than an invention of it. Their astronomy appears complete because they inherited it complete. Their mathematics appears sophisticated because it was already sophisticated when they received it. Their writing appears fully formed because someone taught them a fully formed system. And that teaching, that transfer of knowledge from one civilization to another, from one age to another, from before the flood to after, is the real mystery at the heart of Sumer. The question that all the tablets are trying to answer. The question of where wisdom comes from, and whether we generate it or whether we receive it from sources we've forgotten how to name. The sun is high now. The desert stretches in all directions. The ruins of Ur shimmer in the heat, and you're alone on top of this artificial mountain, built by people who died 4,000 years ago. Built by people who knew things about the sky that took us until the space age to confirm. And the silence is so complete, you can hear your own heartbeat, can hear the blood moving through your body, can hear the faint buzz of insects somewhere far below. And in that silence, you understand something the Sumerians understood, that observation is a form of prayer, that paying attention to the movements of the cosmos is a way of participating in them, that the act of measuring Venus's orbit across decades is itself a kind of love, a devotion to something larger than yourself, a way of saying to the universe, I see you, I'm watching, I'm recording your patterns because your patterns matter, because you matter, because maybe we're all part of the same vast pattern, and understanding the part we can see helps us understand the part we can't. The Sumerians weren't just astronomers. They were people trying to maintain connection with something they felt slipping away, trying to remember what their ancestors knew before the flood, trying to preserve the science of heaven before heaven withdrew completely and left humanity alone on earth, with only the stars to remind us that we used to be part of something greater. And maybe we still are. Maybe we're still embedded in patterns too large to see. Maybe the story the sky tells is still being written, and we're still part of it, whether we remember how to read celestial language or not. Chapter 4. The Forbidden Sciences. You're in the basement of the Baghdad Museum, 1938, and the bronze tool in your hands is 3,200 years old, and it's perfect. And that perfection is what terrifies you. The way the cutting edge still holds its angle after millennia. The way the metal feels alive against your palm. Warm, despite the cool air of the storage room, dense with a weight that speaks of knowledge pressed into matter, of understanding transformed into form. The alloy ratio is exact. You've had it tested. 68% copper, 32% tin. The precise mixture that makes bronze hard enough to hold an edge, but soft enough not to shatter. And metallurgists looking at this composition have told you, with quiet confusion, that this ratio suggests experimentation, suggests trial and error, suggests generations of smiths learning through failure what proportions work best. Except this tool comes from early Sumer, from a time when metallurgy was supposedly just beginning, when humans were supposedly just discovering that heating certain rocks produces metal. And there are no practice pieces, no failed attempts, no evidence of learning. Just this perfect tool appearing in the archaeological record as if someone already knew exactly how to make it. You turn it slowly in your hands and watch light slide across the surface, across the faint hammer marks that show it was forged, not cast, shaped by someone who understood not just the chemistry of alloy, but the physics of crystalline structure, who knew that working the metal while hot aligns the grain, makes it stronger, creates patterns of stress and resilience that turn simple bronze into something that lasts for 3 millennia and still feels ready to cut, to shape, to build. The tablet lying next to the tool on the workbench describes its creation, and the language is technical, specific, using words that translate awkwardly into English because they describe processes we had to rediscover. Concepts like annealing and work hardening, and the careful control of carbon content that turns copper into bronze, and bronze into something approaching steel. The Sumerians wrote about fire temperatures, about the color of flame and what it means, about adding charcoal to copper ore and watching the transformation. And these aren't vague, mystical descriptions. These are instructions. These are recipes written by people who understood that matter transforms according to rules. That if you do this, then that happens. That the universe is consistent and therefore knowable, and therefore something you can write down for others to follow. You've spent weeks comparing these metallurgical tablets to modern chemistry textbooks, and the parallels are disturbing. Not because they're identical, but because they're recognizable. Because someone 3,000 years ago understood oxidation and reduction, understood that heating certain minerals in the presence of carbon draws out metal, understood it practically, if not theoretically, understood it well enough to teach it, to transmit it, to ensure that the knowledge didn't die with a single generation of smiths. That continuity, that institutional transmission of technical knowledge suggests infrastructure, suggests schools or guilds or temple workshops where masters trained apprentices in a curriculum that had already been standardized, already been tested, already been refined into a system that produced consistent results. And systems like that don't appear overnight. They require time. They require iteration. They require something that looks suspiciously like the scientific method applied before science had a name. But the metallurgy is only the beginning. The first layer of a deeper strangeness that opens the more you study the technical tablets that fill this storage room in careful rows, each one a voice from the deep past trying to teach you something that archaeology has decided in advance these people couldn't have known. You pick up another tablet, and this one is a medical text, and it lists over 200 plants organized by their effects on the human body. Diuretic, antiseptic, analgesic. Categories that suggest empirical testing, that suggest someone systematically tried different plants for different ailments and recorded what worked. And the precision of the dosages makes your hands shake slightly. Because these aren't guesses. These are measurements. These are instructions that say, take this much of this plant combined with this much of that mineral dissolved in this much water, and the illness will subside. And modern pharmacologists have analyzed some of these recipes and found that, yes, they work. The combinations have synergistic effects. The dosages are therapeutic. The ancient physicians who wrote these tablets understood something about chemistry and biology that we're only now confirming in laboratories with equipment they didn't have, with theories they never articulated, with a framework of understanding that's supposed to have been invented by Greeks 2,000 years after these tablets were pressed into wet clay. One medical tablet describes a surgical procedure, trepanation, drilling a hole in the skull to relieve pressure from head trauma, and the instructions are terrifyingly specific. It describes how to mark the location, how to score the bone in a circle, how to drill carefully so you penetrate the skull without damaging the brain beneath, how to clean the wound with wine and honey, both of which we now know have antiseptic properties. And at the bottom of the tablet, there's a note in smaller script that says, "If the patient survives until the moon completes one cycle, then recovery is likely." And that time frame, 29 days, is exactly the period modern medicine recognizes as critical for brain injury recovery, the window during which infection or swelling will kill the patient if they're going to die. And the Sumerians knew this, recorded this, passed this knowledge forward. And when archaeologists find skulls with healed trepanation holes, with evidence that the patient lived for years after the procedure, you have to sit with the reality that Bronze Age surgeons were performing brain surgery successfully. We're doing it often enough to have standardized protocols. We're teaching it to students who then taught it to their students in an unbroken chain of knowledge that stretches back to the very beginning of Sumerian civilization, or perhaps before, back to the mysterious source from which so much of their knowledge seems to flow. The mathematics tablets are what finally break you, what make you walk out of the storage room and stand in the alley behind the museum, breathing the hot Baghdad air, and trying to reconcile what you've been reading with what you thought you knew about the history of human thought. One tablet, catalogued as Plimpton 322, is a list of numbers arranged in 4 columns, and for decades no one understood what it was. It sat in collections labeled as a commercial account or a grain inventory, just another bureaucratic document from ancient Mesopotamia, until a mathematician looked at it closely and realized, with a shock that made him call colleagues at midnight, that this tablet, this 4,000-year-old piece of clay, contains Pythagorean triples, sets of 3 numbers that form right-angle triangles, and not just the simple ones like 3, 4, 5, but complex ones, sophisticated ones, ones that demonstrate understanding of the relationship between the sides of right triangles 1,000 years before Pythagoras was born, 1,500 years before the Greeks supposedly invented geometry. The numbers are arranged systematically, organized according to principles that suggest this wasn't a list of examples, but a table for calculation, a reference tool that Sumerian engineers or scribes could use to solve practical problems involving right angles and distance and the relationship between height and length. And the existence of this tablet means the Sumerians had geometric theory, had mathematical abstraction, had the ability to recognize patterns in numbers and encode those patterns into tools that others could use without understanding the underlying theory, which is exactly how science works, how knowledge accumulates, how one generation's discoveries become the next generation's tools. You go back inside and pick up another mathematical tablet, and this one calculates square roots, gives approximations that are accurate to 6 decimal places, uses a method that modern mathematicians recognize as a recursive algorithm, a technique that wasn't supposed to be discovered until the Renaissance. And you set that tablet down and pick up another, and this one is about compound interest, about calculating the growth of debts over time, about understanding exponential functions 2,000 years before exponential functions were formally defined. And another tablet calculates the volume of a truncated pyramid. Another finds the area of irregular polygons. Another solves what we would call quadratic equations, using a method that looks different from the quadratic formula, but produces the same results. And you sit there, surrounded by mathematical sophistication that has no business existing in the 3rd millennium before the Common Era. surrounded by evidence that the Sumerians were doing advanced mathematics not as isolated geniuses, but as a normal part of their scribal curriculum, teaching it in schools, expecting students to master it, treating it as fundamental knowledge that every educated person should possess. If you're still with me, if you're still here in this basement where ancient knowledge sleeps in clay, waiting to be read, waiting to challenge everything we think we know about the development of human thought, take a moment to consider what it means that these tablets exist. What it means that metallurgy and medicine and mathematics all appear in early Sumer already developed, already systematized, already being taught rather than discovered. Leave a comment about whether you think the Sumerians invented these sciences or inherited them. Whether you believe human genius can spontaneously generate this level of sophistication, or whether knowledge like this requires time, requires accumulation, requires sources that we haven't found yet, because they drowned when the waters rose and the old coastlines vanished beneath the sea. The question we're sitting with isn't whether the Sumerians were smart. Obviously, they were smart, brilliantly smart, but intelligence alone doesn't explain the completeness of their knowledge, doesn't explain why they weren't fumbling toward understanding, but writing textbooks, why their first metallurgy is already good metallurgy, why their first mathematics is already sophisticated mathematics, why everything appears not in embryonic form, but in mature expression. The Sumerians themselves had an answer to this question, and their answer appears again and again across thousands of tablets, appears so consistently that ignoring it requires a kind of willful blindness, a decision made in advance that their explanation can't be taken seriously, even though they were the ones who actually possessed this knowledge, who actually performed these metallurgical and medical and mathematical feats that we're still trying to understand. They said the knowledge was given to them. They said they were taught by the Anunnaki, those who from heaven to earth came. And whether you interpret that as literal beings descending from the sky, or as a poetic way of describing inherited knowledge from a pre-flood civilization, or as a mythological framework for understanding their own genius, the consistent claim is that they were receivers, not originators, students, not inventors, custodians of wisdom that came from somewhere else, from some earlier source that possessed this knowledge in even more complete form. The word they used for this transmitted knowledge was me, and me is almost untranslatable because it sits at the intersection of several concepts that English keeps separate. It means something like divine formula, or cosmic principle, or fundamental code. It's the underlying pattern that makes something what it is, the invisible structure that governs manifestation. And the Sumerians believed that everything from kingship to music to metallurgy had its ME, its essential pattern, and that these patterns could be known, could be written down, could be transferred from those who possessed them to those who needed them. The myth of Inanna and Enki describes how the goddess of Uruk traveled to the city of Eridu, where Enki, the god of wisdom, kept the ME of civilization in his possession, and through trickery or seduction, depending on which version you read, Inanna got Enki drunk and stole the ME, carrying them back to Uruk, where they transformed her city into a center of culture and knowledge and power. The story is usually read as a political myth, as a way of explaining how Uruk became the dominant city. But underneath the narrative is a deeper idea, that knowledge is transferable, that it exists independent of individuals, that it can be stolen or lost or recovered, that it's not something humans generate through individual genius, but something that exists objectively, and that some people or places or civilizations have access to while others don't. The ME tablets that Inanna stole included the formulas for metalworking, for writing, for building, for healing, for making music, for establishing law, for understanding the movements of the heavens, all the technical and cultural knowledge that makes civilization possible. And the story presents these not as things to be invented, but as things to be acquired, to be learned from those who already possess them. And maybe the Sumerians were trying to tell us something literal, trying to say that they learned from someone who came before, that their sudden appearance with all this knowledge wasn't miraculous but explicable, that there was a source and they were drawing from it, preserving it, passing it forward in the hope that it wouldn't be lost again the way it was lost before in whatever catastrophe preceded their emergence. The technical tablets you've been studying have a quality that's hard to describe, a tone that comes through even in translation, and the tone is not exploratory but preservational. Not the voice of someone discovering, but the voice of someone recording. Not, "Look what I found," but "Here's what you need to know." And that difference matters, because it suggests the Sumerians saw themselves as archivists of knowledge rather than pioneers of it, saw themselves as trying to preserve something that was already ancient when they received it, already fragmentary, already fading. And their obsessive documentation, their creation of libraries with tens of thousands of tablets, their repetition of the same formulas across multiple copies stored in different cities, all of it speaks to a fear of loss, a determination that what they knew wouldn't vanish the way it had vanished before, that this time, this cycle, the knowledge would survive in clay, if not in stone, would last long enough for future generations to find it and use it, and perhaps understand it better than they themselves did. You're holding pieces of that preservation effort, holding tablets that were baked 4,000 years ago by people who wanted you specifically to exist, wanted someone in the far future to read their words and realize that human knowledge is older than we've been taught, deeper than we've been told, more fragile than we like to admit. Are you ready to see where they kept this knowledge? Because the technical tablets you've been studying came from somewhere. They weren't scattered randomly across the desert, but collected, organized, preserved in specific places by specific people who understood that knowledge dies without institutional support, without libraries, without schools, without the infrastructure of learning that transforms individual insight into collective wisdom. The Sumerians built that infrastructure, created the first libraries in human history, places where tablets were filed and cataloged and protected, where scribes studied for decades to master the cuneiform script and the various specialized vocabularies of law and medicine and mathematics and astronomy, where knowledge was treated not as private property, but as public trust, as something that belonged to civilization itself, and needed to be guarded against the chaos that constantly threatens to overwhelm order, against the forgetting that erases everything unless some institution, fights to preserve memory against the tide of time that washes everything away eventually, unless you write it down, unless you bake it into clay, unless you build libraries that last longer than empires, and trust that someone will care enough to dig through the ruins and read what you so desperately needed to say. The Clay Archives. You're standing in the ruins of Nippur in 1889, and the silence is so profound, it feels like pressure against your eardrums, like the weight of 4,000 years pressing down on this place where 40,000 tablets sleep beneath the sand. And your hands are shaking as you brush dust from the edge of what you've just realized is not a wall, but a shelf. A clay shelf built into the structure of this room. And on that shelf are tablets stacked in careful rows, organized, cataloged, preserved by people who understood that knowledge dies without care, without intention, without someone deciding that memory matters enough to protect it against the chaos that constantly tries to erase everything. The air smells of dust and clay and something else, something that makes you think of old paper, even though there's no paper here. Just the mineral scent of earth that's been shaped by human hands and baked hard and left to wait in darkness for someone to find it, for someone to care, for someone to understand that this room isn't just a storage space, but a library. Perhaps the first library in human history. A place where knowledge was collected and organized, not for one person's use, but for civilization itself. For the eternal project of preserving what's been learned, so it doesn't have to be learned again from nothing after the next catastrophe, after the next flood, after the next time the world forgets. You lift one tablet from the shelf and it's heavier than you expected, dense with the weight of fired clay and information pressed into every surface, and the wedge marks are so precise, so deliberate, that you can almost see the scribe who made them, can almost feel the concentration required to press each symbol correctly, to maintain the grid pattern, to ensure that this copy matches the master tablet exactly, because accuracy matters. Because if you're going to preserve knowledge for thousands of years, then you can't allow errors to creep in, can't let meaning drift through careless copying, can't permit the slow degradation that turns truth into approximation, into myth, into nothing. The tablet in your hands is part of a series. You can tell from the notation at the bottom that says, "This is tablet 7 of 12, and that organizational system, that recognition that some knowledge requires multiple tablets to contain, that there's a sequence that must be followed, speaks to minds that understood how information works, how it needs to be structured, how preservation requires not just writing things down, but writing them down in ways that others can access, can follow, can build upon. This isn't one person's private notes, this is public knowledge made permanent. This is civilization teaching itself to remember." The room you're standing in was once called the Aduba, the tablet house, and it wasn't just a library, but a school. A place where young scribes spent decades learning to read and write the complex cuneiform script, learning the thousands of symbols required to express Sumerian and Akkadian, learning the specialized vocabularies of law and medicine and astronomy and mathematics, learning the hymns and prayers and myths that formed the cultural foundation of Mesopotamian civilization. The tablets on these shelves include student exercises. You can see them mixed among the reference works. Practice tablets where apprentice scribes copied the same text over and over until their hand learned the rhythm, until the symbols flowed naturally, until they could press a sign without thinking about it the way you form letters without considering each curve and line. Some of these practice tablets have corrections in a different hand, a teacher's marks showing where the student went wrong, where they pressed too hard or not hard enough, where they confused one symbol for another. And there's something deeply moving about these corrections, about the care that went into teaching, about the fact that 4,000 years ago, someone thought education mattered enough to spend time helping a young person learn to write, to think, to become part of the long chain of knowledge transmission that stretches from the deep past into whatever future might come. But mixed among the student work and the reference tablets are texts that make your breath catch, that make you sit down on the dusty floor because your legs won't hold you anymore. You've found copies of the Epic of Gilgamesh, the story of the king who searched for immortality and found instead the wisdom of mortality. And these copies are old, older than any other version known, and they differ slightly from the later Akkadian versions, which means you're reading closer to the original, closer to whatever true story or historical memory was transformed over centuries into the epic that would eventually influence everything from the Hebrew Bible to Greek philosophy. One tablet describes Gilgamesh's journey to meet Utnapishtim, the survivor of the Great Flood, and the flood story here is told with details that don't appear in later versions, details about the color of the water, about the sound the rain made, about the silence that followed when the waters receded, and Utnapishtim opened the window of his vessel and saw nothing. No land, no birds, no sign that the world had survived, just water extending in every direction under a sky that had stopped speaking. And you read those words and realize you're not reading myth, you're reading trauma. You're reading the testimony of someone who survived something terrible and tried to describe it in language that could contain the vastness of loss, the absolute erasure of everything familiar, and failed, because language always fails in the face of catastrophe, but tried anyway, because silence would be worse, because not recording what happened would mean it happened to no one, meant nothing, left no trace. The tablets from Nippur tell you something the Sumerians themselves might not have consciously understood, but which becomes clear when you read enough of them, when you see the patterns in how they wrote, in what they chose to preserve. They were terrified of forgetting. Not the normal human fear of personal memory fading, but a civilizational terror, a species-level anxiety about loss, about knowledge vanishing, about having to start over from nothing. And that fear shows up in how obsessively they copied texts, how they made multiple versions of important tablets and stored them in different cities, so that if one archive burned or flooded or was destroyed by war, the knowledge would survive elsewhere. How they created standardized reference works that scribes across Mesopotamia could consult. How they treated the act of writing as sacred. How their goddess of scribes, Nisaba, was also the goddess of grain and measurement and wisdom. How they understood that writing and agriculture and mathematics and record-keeping were all aspects of the same fundamental human project, which is to create order, to push back chaos, to build something that lasts longer than individual lives, longer than single generations, longer than the brief flickering moment any of us inhabit this world. If you're still here in this silence, if you're still sitting on the floor of this ancient library, surrounded by voices that have been waiting 4,000 years to be heard again, take a moment to think about what it means to preserve knowledge, about what we choose to write down and what we let fade from memory, about whether we're as intentional about preservation as the Sumerians were, or whether we've become careless, whether we've started to believe that knowledge is easy, that it accumulates automatically, that we don't need to fight for it the way they fought for it, by pressing every precious piece of understanding into clay and baking it hard enough to survive millennia. Leave a comment about what you would preserve if you knew the world was going to end. If you knew there would be survivors, but they would have to start over with only what you managed to write down before the waters rose. What knowledge would you choose to save? What would you press into whatever medium might last long enough for future generations to find and read and use to rebuild what was lost? 300 miles north of Nippur, in the ruins of Nineveh, another library waited in darkness. And when archaeologists found it in 1845, they found something that shouldn't have survived, that survived only because the palace that housed it burned, because fire turned clay tablets from merely hard to permanently hardened, because destruction paradoxically preserved what it was trying to erase.
The library of ASHURBANIPAL contained over 30,000 tablets, and ASHURBANIPAL was Assyrian, came 1,000 years after the golden age of Sumer, but he knew that Sumerian tablets held knowledge his own civilization had lost or never possessed, and he sent scribes throughout Mesopotamia to collect and copy every important text they could find, to bring them to Nineveh, to create an archive that would contain the accumulated wisdom of the ancient Near East. The tablets he collected included Sumerian originals from Nippur and Uruk and Eridu, included astronomical observations going back 2,000 years, included medical texts and mathematical tables and myths and prayers and king lists and flood stories. And many of these tablets carried colophons, notes added by the scribes who copied them, and those colophons are what break your heart when you read them, because they say things like, copied from an ancient tablet, original damaged, text uncertain, or from the old tablets found in the ruins, or restored with care where the original was broken. And you realize that even in Ashurbanipal's time, even 1,000 years closer to the source, the Assyrian scribes were working from texts they considered ancient, from tablets already fragmentary, from knowledge already fading, and they were doing exactly what you're doing, trying to preserve what little remained, trying to ensure that the long chain of memory didn't break completely, trying to save something from the wreckage of the past. One colophon in particular haunts you, written in small, neat script at the bottom of a tablet containing astronomical observations, and it says, "I have written what was left to me."
and the resignation in those words, the grief, the acknowledgement that this scribe knew he was working with fragments, knew that much had already been lost, knew he was saving only a portion of what once existed, but was saving it anyway, because a portion is better than nothing.
Because memory matters even when it's incomplete, especially when it's incomplete. Because incomplete memory is all we have, all we've ever had, all any civilization has as it tries to understand where it came from and what it's building toward. The Assyrian scribes were archaeologists of their own past, digging through ruins, reading damaged tablets, trying to make sense of texts written in languages they had to relearn, preserving knowledge they themselves didn't fully understand because they believed understanding wasn't required for preservation, because they believed future generations might understand what they couldn't, might piece together what seemed fragmentary to them, might find meaning in what they were faithfully copying, even when that meaning escaped them. The library at Nineveh burned when the city fell in 612 BCE, and the fire that destroyed the palace hardened the tablets until they were nearly indestructible, until they could survive another 2,000 years buried in rubble, waiting for Victorian archaeologists to uncover them, to read them, to realize what had been found. The tablets that came out of that excavation changed everything we thought we knew about ancient history, proved that the Bible's flood story had Mesopotamian antecedents, revealed the epic of Gilgamesh to a world that had forgotten it existed, showed that mathematics and astronomy and literature were far older and more sophisticated than European scholars had imagined. The library survived because it burned, and maybe there's something symbolic in that. Something about how destruction and preservation are sometimes the same thing, how catastrophe can paradoxically ensure survival, how fire can be both enemy and ally of memory, depending on the medium, depending on whether you're trying to save paper or clay, depending on whether the material you've chosen to store information in is vulnerable to heat or strengthened by it. And maybe the Sumerians knew this.
Maybe that's why they chose clay. Maybe they understood that clay survives what paper doesn't, survives what stone eventually doesn't, survives because it's humble, because it's earth, transformed by fire into something harder than earth, something that carries the flexibility of mud and the permanence of rock. You're sitting in the British Museum now, decades after Nippur, decades after Nineveh, and you're surrounded by tablets that contain the voices of people who died 4,000 years ago. People who pressed their thoughts into wet clay, never imagining that you would exist, never imagining that their words would outlast their language, their cities, their entire civilization. And yet, here you are, reading them, understanding them, feeling the urgency underneath the bureaucratic language, the fear underneath the careful organization, the love underneath the obsessive preservation. Because you can only be this careful with knowledge if you love it, if you understand its fragility, if you've seen what happens when it's lost, and you're determined not to let it be lost again. The tablets tell you things about mathematics and medicine and law, but they also tell you something more fundamental. They tell you that the Sumerians believed memory was worth fighting for, that knowledge was sacred not because gods gave it, but because humans need it, because without it, we're lost, because forgetting is the worst death, worse than physical death, because when knowledge dies, it takes with it all the people who possessed it, makes it as if they never existed, never learned, never understood, never pressed their understanding into clay in the hope that someone someday would care enough to read it. Are you ready to understand what they were so desperate to preserve? Because the tablets from Nippur and Nineveh don't just contain practical knowledge, don't just contain astronomy and medicine and mathematics. They also contain stories, myths, creation accounts that describe where humanity came from, how we were made, who made us. And these stories appear again and again across thousands of tablets with a consistency that suggests they weren't considered fiction, but history, weren't considered metaphor, but memory, weren't considered poetry, but testimony about events that happened in a time so distant that only story could preserve them. Only myth could carry them forward. Only clay pressed by faithful hands could ensure they survived the forgetting that erases everything else. The creation stories say humanity was fashioned from clay mixed with the blood of gods, say we were made to work, to serve, to maintain what the gods had built. Say we were given intelligence and language and knowledge, not as a gift, but as tools necessary for our function. And whether you read this literally or symbolically, or somewhere in between, the stories insist that we are designed, that we are intentional, that something or someone shaped us for a purpose, and that purpose has something to do with memory, with preservation, with being the species that writes things down, that looks at the universe and tries to understand it, that presses meaning into matter and hopes it lasts long enough for meaning to be found again by whoever comes after. And maybe that's what we are. Maybe that's the deep truth the creation myths are trying to tell us. That we're the universe's way of remembering itself. That consciousness is memory made flesh. That every library is a small-scale model of what we are collectively trying to do, which is to ensure that what's been learned doesn't vanish completely when the waters rise again. Chapter 6. The Blood of Gods. You're reading by candlelight in your study in Oxford, 1923, and the tablet translation in front of you describes something that shouldn't be possible to describe, shouldn't be knowable to people who lived 4,000 years ago, and your hands are shaking slightly as you read the words again, as you try to understand what the Atrahasis epic is actually saying beneath the mythological language, beneath the gods and the divine councils and the poetic metaphors. Because the more you read, the more it sounds less like mythology and more like memory, less like imagination and more like instruction, less like story and more like the kind of technical description someone would write if they were trying to explain a process they'd witnessed but didn't have adequate vocabulary to describe. The tablet says, "The gods grew tired of their labor, of the endless work of maintaining the world they'd created, of digging rivers and building structures and cultivating fields, and they decided to create workers to do this labor for them." And the description of how they created these workers is where the text becomes strange, becomes specific in ways that make you uncomfortable. Because it doesn't say the gods spoke humans into existence or thought them into being. It says they took clay from the earth and mixed it with something else, something the text calls the blood of a god, the essence, the seed, the genetic material, though of course the Sumerians didn't have that term, didn't have the framework to call it DNA or genetic code. But they described mixing the physical substance of earth with the life-bearing fluid of divine beings, and from that mixture came humanity, came us, came conscious beings who could think and speak and work and remember. The details are what disturb you most, the way the text describes Enki and Ninmah, the god of wisdom and the goddess of birth, gathering to perform this creation. And it's not described as a single magical act, but as a process, as experimentation, as trial and error that sounds disturbingly like what we would now call genetic engineering. The text says they tried 14 times before they succeeded, that the first attempts produced beings that were flawed. One was blind, one couldn't speak, one couldn't reproduce, one had malformed limbs, and with each failure they adjusted the mixture, changed the proportions, modified the process, until finally they created humans who worked correctly, who could survive and reproduce and perform the labor the gods required. This isn't the language of divine fiat. This isn't, "Let there be humans," and humans appeared. This is the language of procedure, of methodology, of people describing something they saw or something they were told about by people who saw it. And the fact that it's wrapped in mythological framework doesn't erase the specific technical character of the description, the sense that underneath the poetry is a memory of something that actually happened, some event that was so far outside normal human experience that the only way to preserve it was through story, through the transformation of incomprehensible technology into comprehensible miracle. You set the translation down and pick up the original tablet photographs, study the cuneiform, check the translation against the symbols pressed into clay 4 millennia ago, and the words are there, unmistakable. The phrase that in Sumerian is Tsalma Elohim, and in Hebrew will become Tselem Elohim, in the image of God. The idea that humans carry something divine in their construction, something that makes us different from animals, something that connects us to whatever made us. And that phrase appears not just in Sumerian sources, but in texts across the ancient world. In Egypt, where humans are shaped from the tears of Ra, in Greece, where Prometheus forms us from clay and steals fire to animate us, in the Hebrew Bible, where God fashions Adam from dust and breathes life into his nostrils. And the story is always the same beneath the cultural variations, always mixing earth with divine essence, always describing a process of combination, of integration,
of two substances becoming one, to create something new that carries properties of both its origins. The consistency of this narrative across cultures that supposedly never contacted each other is what keeps you awake at night, what makes you pace your study while the candles burn down. Because either this is the most successful myth in human history, spreading across continents through some mechanism we don't understand, or it's not a myth at all, but a memory. A very old memory of an event that predates the divergence of these cultures. An event that happened when humanity was still unified, still spoke one language, still possessed one story about its own origins. And that story survived the scattering, survived the flood, survived the forgetting, survived as myth because myth was the only container that could hold it. The Atrahasis epic calls the pre-human workers Lulu Amelu, primitive workers, and describes them as lacking something, lacking speech or reason, or the spark that makes consciousness possible. And the text says, the gods saw that these primitive beings weren't sufficient, weren't capable of the complex labor required, so they enhanced them, added to their mixture the blood of a god, specifically the god We'ila, who was sacrificed for this purpose, whose essence was divided among the clay-formed bodies to give them intelligence, to give them language, to give them the capacity to learn and remember and transmit knowledge across generations. You read this description and you think about evolution, about how modern humans emerged relatively suddenly from hominid ancestors who were physically similar but mentally different, about how there's a gap in the fossil record, a jump in brain size and complexity that anthropologists call the Great Leap Forward, about how art and music and burial rituals and symbolic thinking all appear together in the archaeological record around 40,000 years ago, as if a switch was thrown, as if something changed in our ancestors that made them suddenly human in a way they weren't before. And you wonder if the Sumerian creation myths are describing this change, are preserving a memory of whatever caused that leap, whether it was natural evolution or something else, something the myths hint at, but which we've decided can't be real, because it challenges our assumptions about being alone in the universe, about being the product of purely natural processes, about there being no intention in our existence beyond the blind mechanics of natural selection. If you're still here, if you're still willing to sit with the discomfort of these stories that refuse to fit neatly into either the category of pure myth or pure history, take a moment to consider what it would mean if the creation accounts contain literal truth. Not the poetic metaphorical truth that scholars are comfortable acknowledging, but actual technical description translated into the only language available to Bronze Age peoples trying to describe biotechnology or genetic manipulation or whatever process the myths are gesturing toward. Leave a comment about what you think consciousness is, where it comes from, whether it evolved gradually through natural selection, or whether there's something in the human story that's stranger than we've been told. Whether the persistent global myth of divine human hybridization points to something real that happened in the deep past, something that made us what we are, something that gave us language and symbolic thinking
and the ability to write creation myths in the first place. The question isn't whether gods literally mixed clay with blood. The question is what event or process or intervention the myths are describing. What reality is being preserved in symbolic form because direct description was impossible. Because the people who witnessed whatever happened didn't have the conceptual vocabulary to explain it any other way. The Sumerian myths don't just describe creation, they describe purpose, and the purpose they assign to humanity is specific and strange. They say we were made to work, to maintain, to serve. But the work they describe isn't mindless labor, it's the work of consciousness, the work of observation and record-keeping, the work of measuring the heavens and preserving knowledge and maintaining the connection between earth and sky through ritual and writing and the careful transmission of wisdom across generations. The Aduba tablets, the school texts you've been studying, say that humans are created as the servants of heaven, and that service isn't slavery but stewardship, isn't exploitation but partnership. The gods need humans to keep the world ordered, to prevent the return of chaos, to ensure that what's been built doesn't collapse back into the formless void from which it emerged. And humans need the gods for knowledge, for the ME, for the divine formulas that make civilization possible. And this relationship of mutual dependence is what the myths describe, what the rituals enact, what the libraries preserve. This idea that we're part of something larger than ourselves, that we have a function in the cosmic order, that our consciousness isn't an accident, but a necessary feature of how reality maintains itself against entropy. The Hebrew Bible takes the Sumerian creation story and simplifies it, removes the multiple gods and the divine council and the trial and error experimentation, but keeps the essential structure, keeps the mixing of earth and divine breath, keeps the idea that humans are made in the image of the divine, keeps the sense that we're different from other creatures not just in degree, but in kind, that we possess something that connects us to whatever made us. Genesis says God formed man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. And the Hebrew word for soul, nephesh, means something like self or life force, or the animating principle that makes matter alive. And it's the same concept the Sumerians expressed when they talked about mixing clay with the blood of gods, about combining physical substance with spiritual essence to create beings who are both earthly and divine, both mortal and eternal, both animal and something more than animal. The story survives because it's trying to explain something that needs explanation, trying to account for consciousness, for self-awareness, for the strange fact that we can contemplate our own existence, can ask where we came from, can write creation myths that try to answer questions that perhaps don't have answers, or perhaps have answers we're not ready to hear. You think about the Anunnaki, those beings the Sumerians described as coming from heaven to earth, as teaching humanity the arts of civilization, as interbreeding with humans in some versions of the myths, and you think about the Nephilim in Genesis, the giants born when the sons of God came to the daughters of men, and you think about similar stories in Greek mythology, where gods father half-divine children, and in Hindu texts where the devas descend from celestial realms to interact with humans. And the pattern repeats, always the same story of beings from above mixing with beings from below to create something new, something hybrid, something that carries characteristics of both parent species. And you wonder if species is even the right word, if what the myths are describing is better understood as different states of being, different levels of consciousness, different relationships to time and space and physical law, and if the great accomplishment of the Anunnaki, or the Elohim, or whatever name these beings go by in different cultures, was teaching humans how to be conscious, how to remember, how to pass knowledge forward through writing and ritual, and the careful preservation of memory against the forgetting that erases everything, eventually, unless someone fights to preserve it. The creation myths say humans were made to remember, and maybe that's not metaphor. Maybe that's the most literal truth the tablets contain, that we are the remembering species, the species that writes things down, that looks at the stars and records what it sees, that experiences consciousness and tries to understand what consciousness is, that builds libraries and preserves knowledge and fights against entropy through the sheer force of caring about meaning, about truth, about ensuring that what's been learned doesn't vanish when individuals die. The Sumerians saw this clearly, saw that their purpose was preservation, saw that they existed in the aftermath of something that tried to erase memory, saw that their job was to rebuild what the flood had destroyed, to restore what had been lost, to serve as the bridge between the world that drowned and the world that might come after, if they could just preserve enough knowledge in clay hard enough to survive the next catastrophe. Every tablet they pressed was an act of service, an act of worship, an act of fulfilling the function they believed they were created for, which was keeping the connection alive, keeping the memory alive, keeping the light of consciousness burning in a universe that's mostly dark. You close the Atrahasis translation and sit in silence and think about what it means to be made, to be designed, to be intentional rather than accidental, and you realize that whether the creation myths are literally true or metaphorically true might matter less than the fact that the Sumerians believed they were custodians of something precious, believed they had a responsibility to preserve knowledge, believed that consciousness came with obligation, with the duty to remember and record and transmit. And that belief,
That sense of cosmic responsibility, is what drove them to create the first libraries, the first schools, the first systematic attempts to ensure that what one generation learned wouldn't be lost when that generation died. They took the job seriously, took it so seriously that 4,000 years later, we're still reading their tablets, still hearing their voices, still learning from the knowledge they pressed into clay with such care, with such precision, with such faith that someone would eventually care enough to dig through ruins and translate forgotten languages and reconstruct what they were trying so desperately to preserve. Are you ready to see what happened to that world they were trying to preserve? Because the creation myths don't end with humanity's making. They end with humanity's near destruction. They end with the flood that appears in every ancient culture's memory. The waters that rose and covered the earth and drowned the first world. And the gods who made humans decided to unmake them, decided the experiment had failed, decided that the noise of human civilization was too much, that the chaos we created was worse than the chaos we were meant to prevent. And they sent the waters. They opened the gates of heaven and broke the fountains of the deep, and everything drowned except one man who was warned, who built a vessel, who saved the seed of life, who became the ancestor of the post-flood world, the world we inhabit now, the world the Sumerians were rebuilding when they pressed their first tablets, when they built their first cities, when they looked at the sky and recognized the patterns their ancestors had recorded before the waters rose. And maybe the creation myths and the flood myths are the same story told from different angles. Maybe they're both describing the same cycle of making and unmaking, of building and drowning, of memory and forgetting. And maybe we're still living in that cycle, still building libraries that might burn, still preserving knowledge that might be lost, still hoping that if the waters come again, someone will survive to dig through the ruins and read what we wrote and understand what we were trying to save. Chapter 7. The Silence After the Flood. You're standing where the city of Eridu once stood, 1929, and beneath your feet is nothing. Or rather, beneath your feet is absence, is a layer of clean river silt 2.5 meters thick, with no pottery, no artifacts,
no charcoal, no sign that humans lived here during the time this sediment was deposited. Just pure mud laid down by water that covered everything, that buried cities, that separated the world into before and after, with a line as clear as the line between day and night. And Leonard Woolley, who's directing this excavation, has just called you over to look at the stratigraphy, to see with your own eyes what the tablets have been describing for thousands of years. The physical evidence of the flood that appears in Sumerian myths and Akkadian epics and Hebrew scripture and Greek legends and stories from every culture that can remember back far enough to touch the trauma of when the waters rose. The silence of this layer is what strikes you most. The way it sits between two worlds, between the civilization that built temples here before the waters came and the civilization that rebuilt on top of the ruins after the waters receded. And you kneel and press your hand against the silt, and it's cool and fine-grained and completely sterile. No seeds, no bones, no trace of the life that must have existed here before it drowned. Just the patient geological testimony of water that stayed long enough to bury everything, long enough to erase everything, long enough that when survivors finally returned, they would have found nothing recognizable, nothing to orient themselves by, nothing except the memory of what used to be here before the world ended. The Epic of Ziusudra describes this moment with a specificity that makes your throat tighten, describes the survivor opening the window of his vessel after 7 days of storm and seeing nothing, just water extending to the horizon under a sky that had finally stopped raining. And the text says, "He wept not from joy at surviving, but from grief at what was lost, at the complete erasure of everything familiar, at the silence where cities used to sing, at the absence where civilization used to breathe." And you think about what that silence must have felt like, what it must have been like to be the only human voice in a world that had been drowned, to float on water that covered the ziggurats and the temples and the libraries, to know that beneath you in the dark water were the bodies of everyone you'd known, everyone who didn't make it onto the vessel, everyone who drowned when the gods decided that humanity's experiment had failed and needed to be reset. The flood myths across cultures all carry this tone of grief, this sense of surviving something that shouldn't have been survived, of being chosen not as reward but as burden, of having to carry forward the memory of the world that drowned, of having to rebuild with the knowledge that everything you build can be washed away again if the waters choose to return, if the gods lose patience again, if whatever caused the first flood decides to send another. You dig your fingers into the silt and lift a handful and let it run through your fingers like water, like time, and you think about how this layer exists not just here at Eridu, but at Ur and Kish and Shuruppak and sites throughout Mesopotamia. Not all from the same event, but all evidence that massive flooding did happen, did interrupt human settlement, did create before and after in ways that echo through mythology into history, into the archaeological record that you're kneeling in now. The dating is uncertain. The deepest flood layers go back to around 4,800 years before the Common Era, others to around 3,900, others to 2,900, which suggests not a single catastrophic deluge, but multiple events, multiple times when the Tigris and Euphrates overflowed their banks, when storm surges from the Persian Gulf pushed inland, when the rain fell for days or weeks until the entire valley became a lake, until cities that had stood for centuries vanished beneath water, until the survivors who made it to high ground watched their world dissolve and had to decide whether to stay and rebuild or to abandon the cursed valley and start over somewhere else. But some of them stayed. Some of them came back when the waters receded. Some of them dug through the silt looking for what could be salvaged, and what they found were tablets. Clay tablets that the water couldn't destroy, that the mud only buried and preserved. Tablets that carried the memory of the world before the flood.
And those survivors read the tablets and learned that this had happened before, that their ancestors too had survived waters that tried to erase everything, that the cycle of building and drowning was older than they'd imagined, and they decided to continue the pattern, to rebuild, to restore, to press their own knowledge into clay so that if the waters came again, someone might survive and find their tablets and learn that they too tried to preserve what mattered, tried to fight against the forgetting that follows catastrophe, the way silence follows a scream. The Sumerian flood story calls the survivor Ziusudra. The Akkadian version calls him Utnapishtim. The Hebrew version calls him Noah. But the story they tell is the same story. A man warned by a god who took pity on humanity, a man who built a vessel according to precise specifications, a man who saved not just his family, but the seed of all living things, animals and plants and knowledge, especially knowledge.
Because the texts are clear that what survives isn't just biological life, but cultural life. Isn't just bodies, but memory. Isn't just the species, but the civilization. And maybe that's the real point of the flood myths. Not that humanity almost went extinct, but that human knowledge almost went extinct. That the libraries drowned, that the schools washed away, that the continuous chain of learning that connects one generation to the next was broken. And everything after the flood is humanity trying to forge that chain again, trying to reconnect to what was known before, trying to restore the ME that was lost when the waters came. The texts describe Ziusudra taking tablets onto his vessel, taking the written knowledge of his civilization, and you wonder how much he saved, how much was left on shore to drown, because the vessel couldn't hold everything. How he decided what knowledge mattered most, what could be reconstructed from memory, and what needed to be preserved in writing. And you think about the Sumerians, centuries later, pressing tablets that say, "This is the restoration of what was before." And you realize they weren't just rebuilding cities, they were rebuilding the intellectual infrastructure of the pre-flood world. They were trying to piece together a library from water-damaged fragments. They were archaeologists of their own immediate past, digging through their parents' ruins, reading damaged tablets, trying to remember what had been forgotten in the chaos of survival. If you're still here, if you're still kneeling in the silt of ancient Eridu, with your hands full of the sediment that ended a world, take a moment to think about what survives catastrophe and what doesn't, about how physical things can be replaced, but knowledge once lost is lost forever, unless someone wrote it down, unless someone preserved it, unless someone decided that memory mattered enough to fight for it, even when everything else was being washed away. Leave a comment about what you would try to save if you knew the waters were coming. Not what physical possessions you would grab, but what knowledge you would try to preserve, what understanding you would press into whatever medium might survive, what message you would leave for whoever might dig through the ruins of our world and try to understand what we knew, what we valued, what we were trying to build before the catastrophe came. The flood myths aren't just about water, they're about interruption, about the breaking of continuity, about what it means to have to start over with fragments, with partial memory, with the knowledge that you're rebuilding something that was once whole but is now broken. And maybe that's why the Sumerians were so obsessed with preservation, why they wrote everything down, why they made multiple copies, why they built libraries in different cities. Because they knew, they remembered, they carried in their cultural DNA the trauma of the flood and the determination that it wouldn't happen again. That this time, the knowledge would survive even if the cities didn't. That clay would outlast stone. That writing would outlast memory, that if the waters came again, at least future generations would know that we were here, that we learned things, that we tried to understand the universe and our place in it, that we weren't just surviving, but trying to thrive,
trying to build something beautiful and meaningful in the brief time between catastrophes. The geological evidence suggests that the end of the last ice age, around 12,000 years ago, brought catastrophic flooding to coastlines worldwide. Sea levels rose 400 feet as the glaciers melted, and shorelines that had been stable for 20,000 years suddenly disappeared beneath the waves. And if human civilization existed on those drowned coasts, if cities were built where now there's only ocean,
If knowledge was accumulated during the long, stable period of the Ice Age, when the climate was predictable and resources were abundant, then all of that drowned, all of that was lost, and the survivors who made it inland would have been refugees, would have been traumatized, would have been carrying fragments of a world that no longer existed. And maybe that's what the Sumerians were. Maybe they were the descendants of those survivors. Maybe their sudden appearance with sophisticated knowledge wasn't miraculous, but explicable. Wasn't the beginning of civilization, but the restoration of it. Wasn't innovation, but memory. And the flood myths they told weren't about local Mesopotamian events, but about the much older global catastrophe that reset human development, that drowned the Ice Age civilizations, that forced humanity to start over from fragments, from damaged tablets, from stories that survived when cities didn't. You can dismiss this as speculation, as reading too much into mythology, as projecting modern concerns about climate catastrophe onto ancient texts. Or you can sit with it, can let it disturb you, can consider the possibility that human history is longer than we've been taught, deeper than we've been told, more cyclical than the linear narrative of progress we've constructed to make ourselves feel safe, to make ourselves feel like we're moving forward rather than just running in place, trying to get back to something we had once and lost and are desperately trying to recover before we lose it again. The Sumerian king list says that after the flood swept over, kingship was again lowered from heaven. And that word, again, is everything, is the key that unlocks the whole mystery, because it implies this happened before, implies that kingship, that civilization itself, descends and withdraws in cycles, that what we call human history is just the most recent iteration of a pattern that's older than we can measure, older than our archaeology can reach, buried beneath flood sediment and time and the ocean that covers the places where the first cities might have stood. The Sumerians saw themselves as living in an aftermath, in a recovery period, in the time between the last flood and the next one. And they were right to be anxious, right to preserve obsessively, right to treat knowledge as sacred and fragile. Because knowledge is the only thing that survives catastrophe, the only thing that can bridge the gap between what was and what comes after, the only thing that makes rebuilding possible, rather than just starting over blind and ignorant, making the same mistakes, learning the same lessons at terrible cost, because the previous generation's wisdom was lost when the libraries drowned. Every tablet they pressed was an act of faith, was a message in a bottle thrown into the future, was a prayer that someone would care enough to read it, to value it, to pass it forward. And here we are, 4,000 years later, reading their tablets, hearing their voices, learning from their preservation, proving that their faith was justified, that the effort was worth it, that memory can survive if you care enough to protect it, if you write it down, if you press it into clay and bake it hard, and trust that someone will dig through the ruins and translate the forgotten language and understand what you were trying so desperately to say. The silence that followed the flood is what haunts the tablets most. Not the noise of the storm or the screaming of the drowning, but the silence after. The silence of a world emptied of voices. The silence of cities that used to sing, now buried beneath mud. The silence of knowledge that used to echo in libraries, now lost, except for what was written down, what was preserved, what survived the waters.
The Sumerians broke that silence by writing, by building, by creating sound where there had been none, by filling the void with words and music, and the noise of human civilization rising from the ruins. But underneath their building, you can always hear the silence they were trying to cover, can always feel the absence they were trying to fill, can always sense the grief they carried for the world that drowned, for the knowledge that was lost, for the time before the flood, when things were different, when the connection between heaven and earth was stronger, when the gods walked among humans, when wisdom flowed more freely, when the library was complete rather than fragmentary. They lived in the shadow of that loss, rebuilt in the shadow of that loss, wrote in the shadow of that loss, and everything they created was simultaneously an achievement and a memorial, simultaneously a new beginning and an attempt to recover the old beginning, simultaneously moving forward and looking backward. And maybe that's what all human civilization is. Maybe we're all living in the aftermath of something we don't remember, rebuilding something we've lost, trying to get back to a wholeness we once possessed but can no longer quite imagine except in myths, in stories, in the persistent feeling that we used to be more than we are now, used to know more than we know now, used to be connected to something we've been severed from. And the Sumerians felt this more acutely than we do, because they were closer to the breaking, closer to the flood, closer to the catastrophe that divided history into before and after. Are you ready to see what comes after silence? Because we haven't finished the story yet, haven't reached the ending that the Sumerians were writing toward, the conclusion that all their preservation was preparing for, which is that memory doesn't die, that knowledge once written can survive anything, that the tablets outlasted the civilization that made them, that the clay voices are still speaking 4,000 years after the people who pressed them turned to dust, that we are the future they were writing for, that we are the proof that their effort mattered, that preservation works, that fighting against forgetting is worth the fight, even when you won't live to see whether you succeeded, even when the floods keep coming, even when the silence keeps trying to reclaim everything. Because as long as someone somewhere is still reading, still listening, still paying attention to the voices pressed into clay by people who knew that memory is all we have, all we've ever had, all that separates us from the silence that wants to erase everything, then the flood didn't win, the forgetting didn't win, the silence didn't win. And maybe that's what it means to be human. Maybe that's the purpose the creation myths describe. Maybe we really are the universe's way of remembering itself. The species that writes things down, that looks at the ruins and tries to understand what happened, that digs through the silt looking for tablets, looking for voices, looking for proof that we're not the first, that others came before us and survived catastrophes and rebuilt and left us messages saying, you can survive too. You can rebuild too. You can preserve what matters and pass it forward, and trust that someone will care enough to receive it. And that chain, that long chain of memory passing from hand to hand, from generation to generation, from the deep past into whatever future might come, that's what survives the flood. That's what outlasts the silence. That's what makes us human. You're sitting in silence now, wherever you are, whatever time it is, and maybe you're thinking about the journey we've taken through 5,000 years of memory pressed into clay, through tablets that described kings who ruled for 36,000 years, through astronomical observations that tracked Venus with impossible precision, through metallurgy and mathematics that appeared already perfected, through libraries built to preserve knowledge against the flood everyone remembered, through creation myths that describe humanity as designed rather than accidental, and through the silence that followed catastrophe, the silence the Sumerians broke by writing, by building, by refusing to let the forgetting be complete. The pattern is clear now, even if the explanation remains uncertain. That Sumerian civilization appeared not as humanity's first attempt at complex society, but as its recovery from something older. that the tablets weren't recording the birth of knowledge, but its restoration. That the word the Sumerians used most often wasn't innovation, but remembrance. Wasn't creation, but reconstruction. Wasn't beginning, but continuation of something interrupted when the waters rose. The story the tablets tell isn't the comfortable narrative of linear progress from ignorance to enlightenment, but something stranger. Something that suggests human history moves in cycles rather than straight lines. That civilizations rise and fall and rise again. That knowledge is accumulated and lost and rediscovered. That we've been here before, reached high before, built libraries and cities before, and then something came that reset everything, that left only survivors carrying fragments of what was once whole. From clay to code, from stylus to keyboard, from ziggurat to server farm, the impulse remains the same, the determination to record, to measure, to preserve what's been learned, so knowledge doesn't dissolve, so memory survives even when bodies don't, even when civilizations don't, even when the floods come again, as floods always come. Maybe that's what consciousness is for. Maybe we really are the universe's way of remembering itself, the species that looks at stars and tries to understand, that digs through ruins and translates forgotten languages, that writes things down and trusts that writing matters. The Sumerians understood this, felt this urgency, and they passed it to us across the millennia, passed it through clay that survived what stone didn't, through memory that refused to die completely. What if everything we call progress is actually recovery? What if every discovery is actually remembrance? What if the technology we're inventing was invented before and lost, and we're finding it again following paths our ancestors walked in ages we can no longer see? The Sumerians believed in cycles, believed that what rises must fall, and what falls can rise again. And maybe they were right. Maybe we're living in one turn of that wheel. Maybe our technological flourishing isn't unprecedented, but repetition, isn't beginning, but return. If you're still listening, if you made it this far through tablets and floods and silence and memory, then you're part of this chain now. Part of the long effort to preserve what matters. Part of the fight against forgetting. If something in these stories resonated, if the voice of the Sumerians speaking across 5,000 years touched something in your consciousness, then hit that like button gently and subscribe if you want to continue this journey through mysteries that history tried to bury, and leave a comment about what you think survives catastrophe, about whether memory is enough, about whether we're remembering or discovering, about whether the wheel turns or the line extends. And as you drift towards sleep now, as the voices from ancient Sumer fade back into silence, carry this thought, that you're part of something older than you imagined, more connected to the deep past than modern life allows us to feel. And maybe that connection, that sense of being part of the long chain of consciousness, from the first humans who looked at stars to wherever we're going next, maybe that's what survives the flood. Maybe that's what the clay has been telling us, that we're not alone, not orphaned in time, just one more voice in the ancient chorus, one more consciousness trying to understand what consciousness is for. And the Sumerians would recognize you, would see in you what they saw in themselves, the determination to remember, the refusal to let the silence win, the faith that memory survives, and that's enough. Rest now. The tablets will still be there tomorrow. The voices will still be speaking. But for now, rest. Let it settle into your consciousness, the way sediment settles after a flood, slowly, gently, becoming part of the ground on which new things can grow. And maybe that's what this has been for. Not to answer every question, but to plant questions deep enough that they become part of you, become part of how you see the world, become part of understanding that we're all part of something larger, something older, something the Sumerians glimpsed and preserved, because you're here, because you listened, because the chain didn't break. And now, you can sleep. The memory is safe. The tablets survived. The voices reached you. And that's everything. Rest now. Rest.